Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Conversations in Moral Theology. I'm your host, Alessandro Rovati, and today it's a great pleasure to be joined by Jason Heron and Susan Blum. Jason is a friend and a co-author of an article in the Journal of Moral Theology that we worked on together, titled From Coercion to Fascination, Grades, Vulnerability, and Responsibility. And Susan has been in many ways the inspiration for our work on this topic. And so it's with great honor that we welcome her. She's the author most recently of Schoolishness and of other volumes that reflect on education, assessment, and pedagogy, such as I Love Learning, I Hate School, and a volume on grading. Susan and Jason, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you very much.
So none of us is a pedagogist by training, and yet we have all found ourselves thinking and writing about assessment, pedagogy, life in the classroom. Let's share with our listeners our origin story, if you will. Susan, what got you to think and write about these things?
Oh, wow. Okay. I started as an anthropologist of China, and I did my first, there's a very natural progression from one project to the other, and I've been at this for many decades, so I've had time for many projects. Basically, what happens for me is I finish a project and there's an unfinished question, and that leads me to the next project. So I began studying ethnicity in China, ethnicity and nationalism in China, and some of the people started talking about some ethnic groups being honest and others being clever, and that led me to really explore the idea of truth and deception, which fits very well with my training in linguistic anthropology. And that led me to wonder about plagiarism, because plagiarism is basically a mismatch between the author and the words, and also is about sometimes cheating. And that led me to my first education work, which was called My Word, Plagiarism and College Culture. And I began that work as a very strict grader, a very strict teacher, suspicious of my students, sort of judgmental. And I used my anthropological training to conduct interviews, to do observations, to really suspend judgment, and to be what anthropologists are, sort of radically curious. And I ended up, and also I have a background in psychological anthropology where we talk about socialization and childhood. And I came to realize that if the only motive students have for going to school is a grade, then cheating and plagiarizing are rational, efficient methods of achieving that. And that led me to really think about education, this industry, this sector that I've spent my entire life in, basically. And I began to observe around me, to listen, and do more interviews, and I began to really question the system. And once you start to question the system, it's hard to stop. And the system doesn't exist alone, of course. It exists in a cultural, political, economic framework, but that affects the individuals as well. And so that has led me to become a pretty radical pedagogue. And I have thrown out most of the beliefs I used to have about what institutional education is for. And so I'm trying to share what I've learned over the years. So the ungrading book was really kind of a side project. And then Schoolishness was trying to put it all together in a much more kind of theoretical and philosophical way. And that's, I think, how you both entered the conversation.
Yeah. So my origin story is simple. It's Jason's fault, which is why I'll let Jason tell his origin story.
I've been teaching for like 15 years now. And when I first got to Mount Marty in 2017, we had an interim dean, and we had like these faculty evaluations at the end of the year, and she took me aside and said, uh, it's great you have a PhD and you like your discipline and everything, but your students are scared of you. And I didn't have tenure, you know, and she goes, if they're scared to enroll in your classes and they have other options, what are you going to do if no one enrolls in your classes? Like, what's your plan here? And I didn't have an answer, of course. And she said, you should read chapter 64 of the Rule of St. Benedict. And she said, that's where Benedict says that the abbot of the monastery, the leader of the monastery, should give the strong something to strive for and the weak nothing to fear. And this interim dean was an education professor by training. And she's like, that line from Benedict's rule changed her pedagogy like a long time ago. And so I went back to my office and I read that chapter. And ever since then, I've been thinking about strong and weak students and my responsibility to maintain both the rigor of something for the strong, the rigor of the discipline for the strong, but also openness to the fascination and the possibility and the hope that you could actually accomplish something for the weaker students. And at some point, this led me to ask a small group of 300 level class theology, intro to theology, or maybe even Alessandro, it might have been intro to moral theology. It might have even been a moral theology class. I can't remember. We were talking about Augustine's Confessions, and Augustine early on when he's reflecting on his education experience as a young man, he says that humans are naturally fascinated by things, but then because we're broken, and in Christian language, because we're sinful, we can't count on human fascination. And so we need to coerce people if we know they should be fascinated by something and they're not yet. Now I'm putting all that in my own words, but a student really like identified that as, he's like, is he talking about us? I was like, yeah, he's talking about tests, man. Like we have tests and homework and quizzes because you should be interested in your education, but you're not. And we know better than you, but tests are kind of your fault. And if you would just come to class and like learn just because you wanted to learn, then there would be like no homework. There'd be no tests. There'd be no quizzes. And we started using the language of carrot and stick. And like, you guys are addicted to the stick. And this was early on before I started. Susan, I hadn't encountered your work yet. I certainly hadn't encountered the work of Alfie Kohn yet. But we made a contract that semester. I promised all of them that they could have an A if they promised me that they would just do the work I asked them to do and we would just learn. And that was an amazing experience, except for that it was totally interrupted by COVID. But I had that contract, and after, like, we all signed it, I signed every copy and they signed it and everything. And from there, I don't remember how I got my hands on your ungrading, the edited volume, and then Alfie Kohn and everything. I don't remember how that transpired, but it all came from that experience of Benedict's Rule, chapter 64, Augustine's Confessions, and a few students who had some good questions. We had exit interviews after that experience, and one student was so beautifully honest. She said, I realize I'm really a stick person. I'm really a stick person. The carrot is just not enough for me. And I thought even that was a great outcome for the experiment. So after that, it was just like a quick downhill. Started reading books, started having more conversations with friends like Alessandro, and we just started experimenting. And here we are.
I think for me, I've always been very interested and invested in the question of education to the faith. As a theologian, as someone who understands the work of theology as a vocation, that as one of the fundamental tasks, handing on the faith one generation after another. I've always been interested in the question, how do we hand on, transmit, introduce people to the faith? And in thinking about that, I've always found myself thinking of the way in which we transmit the faith outside of the classroom. And so whether it's catechisms, small groups, intentional communities, again, all things that I've been part of and have led. Growing up in Italy, I was part of a lay movement, Communion and Liberation. So I was very much attuned to the need for a whole life approach to growing and entering into the truth of the faith. And I've always been fascinated by the method of Jesus in the Gospels, a method that for me, the servant of God, Luigi Giussani, helped me really appreciate and understand. A method based on this initial question, what are you looking for? The question that Jesus asks the disciples in his first encounter. And I've always been interested about how the rest of the journey of the disciples, it's really based upon Jesus taking seriously their desire and their need, and how the rest of his own self-revelation to them is showing how he corresponds, he is attuned to, he can heal and transform that humanity, that desire, that heart. And I understood all of that, I taught all of that, I talked about all of that, but I've always perceived the classroom as an inadequate place to embody those commitments, exactly because of the strictures of the system, in particular grades, which for me created really an adversarial relationship with the students, if not almost never explicitly, at least not in my experience, but as a sort of subcurrent. Right? And so when I encountered Jason's contract, the light bulb turned on, right? Because that, for the first time, that gave me the intuition of how even the classroom practices could be reformed, transformed, converted to align better with this vision of the moral life, of the life of faith, which I was deeply committed to. And that our institutions, as we both work in Benedictine Catholic liberal colleges, our institutions are deeply committed to that vision as well in terms of their mission and sense of vocation and task of education. But again, making the step, finding the language, finding the tools to make that inform even something like assessment. Right? So that's really what transformed my classes. I'd say one last thing is I had the intuition of getting rid of grades in working with people who are training with our college to become future permanent deacons. So people who are doing theological training for the sake of a ministerial vocation, of a ministerial role that they will take on in the community. And with them, I started getting rid of grades and using a complete method where if they did not demonstrate knowledge of what we were talking about, I would tell them why and I would let them study more. And the reason for that is that I thought that it would be very silly for deacons to know 2 out of 3 persons of the Trinity and get a 66%. But instead, I really needed to make sure that by the end of the class, they would know all of them. And that was the first step. And then again, Jason, and through Jason, your work, Susan, gave me language and practices for the undergraduate classroom. You mentioned how you are a radical teacher now, Susan. What makes you radical?
Well, I mean, radical to the root. I really do go all the way down to the foundation of what are we here for? And what then, if you start with presuppositions, then you build from there. And so radical in that sense. And that means questioning everything. And of course, the irony is I'm at a very conventional institution. And yet I've managed to basically restructure everything in my classes as best I can. And I still revert sometimes to my old habits of assigning too much reading and things like that, even though I'm studying reading right now and why students read or don't read. And there are a lot of reasons why students don't like the kinds of reading that we assign. And I actually assign a lot of podcasts and TED Talks and magazine articles and all kinds of things that are, I think, a little bit more accessible and also accomplish the same goal, which is, my students are not mostly going to become professional anthropologists. So what is it that they need to do? What are we doing here? What is the big outcome that I'm looking for? And for me, it is much more about unleashing this curiosity, trying to create structures that will lead to curiosity, which will then propel them, motivate them to engage deeply in some of the topics, even though there are no carrots or sticks, except for the intrinsic value of the activity. And of course, that is very hard to do when our students have 5, 6 classes and they have internships and they're leading clubs and they're athletes, and, it's very hard. So sometimes they have responsibilities to a group, which is another value, I think, that we don't talk about enough in education. You're in a classroom with other people. Do you have obligations to them, not just to be polite, but also to do something on their behalf? So I have students leading class, not just giving a talk, but leading a creative activity or something that will help deepen everybody's learning. And because students bring different perspectives, it's really fun. And they learn the most when they're leading class. And then the students who are engaged in it also learn a lot. And so that's one example of questioning the relationships in the classroom, where it's not all teacher-led or teacher-centered, but it's trying to foster a sense of community so that we all work together for ends which may be different for each individual as well. And I can't know that ahead of time. So there's a lot less advanced planning. There's a lot more improvisation. I love this question of Jesus, what are you looking for? And I ask my students that. I may quote that. I mean, I am at a Catholic institution, and students ought to be familiar with this question. And usually they show up and it's like, what do you want me to do? What do I have to know? What's my task? What is my checklist? And that's a rational attitude in a system like this, where especially my students who are very high achieving have been successful using that attitude all throughout their education from early childhood. And so for me to challenge so many of these assumptions, it's hard for them. And it takes time and exposure, but also reassurance and all kinds of things, because there are a lot of stakes in this institutional game of school. And they are very anxious about what comes next. And grades are the currency of accomplishment, which opens the doors to the next level. But radical for sure. And I really don't accept any of the, in my latest book, I go through 10 dimensions of what I call schoolishness, conventional education, and I question all of them. Whether we need to be inside in classrooms, sitting down, whether we need to have credit hours, which has been questioned over and over again. but do you need to have uniform divisions of time? Do you have to have a teacher and a student, or can there be different relationships? And so I question all of it. So in that sense, I do think I'm radical. I'm a pretty conventional person myself in a way. Like I wear my seatbelt, I pay my taxes, I obey the speed limit, I try not to lie, I'm married, and I'm conventional in those ways, but I'm radical in the ways that I approach my teaching.
This is a concern of Alessandro's. I remember when we delivered a version of this paper at College Theology Society, right? CTS. And we each read a portion of it, sitting in front of this, really a full room. I mean, a lot of people showed up to hear this on this. They're interested in this topic. And Alessandro says, "We're not hippies. We're not hippies." And I said, well, I'm a little bit of a hippie. Alessandro's definitely not a hippie. I'm a little bit of a hippie, but yeah, that's funny. You can be conventional and radical.
And I'm a little bit of a hippie by temperament, but
right.
But I really do behave in pretty conventional ways.
My way of thinking about it is I want to take up the radical word because in the sense of going to the roots. And for me, the roots, and our article reflects that, is the Catholic vision of education as articulated by the Church in her official teachings. And when you read the documents, from the documents of the Second Vatican Council all the way up to the many things that the Dicastery for Education has written over the years, there is this insistence on education being about a community of learners walking together towards the truth. And so, in my mind, the need to shift our assessment practices really comes from the demand that such commitments make on us as stewards of this tradition on the one hand, and embodiment of the tradition in the concreteness of the classroom experience on the other. So while probably my way of thinking of myself as a radical is slightly different, I think it places its finger on something really important and really essential. Now, the problem is, as we have been hinting at, is that we operate in a broader system that creates expectations and constraints on such an endeavor. Even if, I must say, I've been very fortunate that my administrators and the senior leadership of the college has immediately understood the connection between the mission and commitments of our institution and what I've been trying to do in the classroom. So at my institution, there has been nothing but support and appreciation for the work I'm doing. Still, though, the students encounter it for the first time in my classes, and they really have to stretch their imagination a little bit in order to accept it. So, Susan, you have been reflecting on the systemic conditions in which we work for a very long time. What would you say are some of the key conditions that we come up against when we try to experiment with these more student-centric initiatives?
Well, I'll answer that, but I also talk about my classes as a community of learners, and I think that this radical idea also addresses the question of what is the unit of analysis and what is the nature of the person that we are operating with. And, I'm not Catholic, but there are these moral dimensions that we have kind of bracketed as we think about these technocratic questions, and really what many people have compared our conventional schooling system to factories. And factories have a kind of they are the quintessential capitalist mode of production, and where you take whatever the raw materials and you subject them to certain kinds of uniform forces in order to produce uniform products, and then to subject those uniform products to an evaluation to make sure they're the same. And so that is the origin of our grading system. People have talked about it as coming from scientific management, which is a early 20th century movement. Basically, people talk about Fordism and the assembly line, and this has a view of the person as somebody who must be controlled and must be sort of subjected to all of this outside force. And from the very beginning, there have been backlashes against that. There is a sense that progressive education, Montessori education, Waldorf education, John Dewey, the Chicago school, the lab school, there have been a lot of other ways people have tried to teach students and younger students. And then in higher ed, now that we have the scaling of, we want more and more and more people to go through higher ed. And so then you have all of these constraints about scale. So this past weekend, I was actually at the University of Georgia talking to a group of people about education. It was people who were really willing to question conventional structures. And this university is really serious, and they have a lot of administrative support. So they have really been promoting active learning university-wide. And so that is a way of breaking down the assumption that students are just going to sit there and be filled up, in this sense that Paulo Freire talks about, of being empty vessels that are being stuffed with knowledge, or the banking model. So if active learning is implemented widely, then there's already a little bit of a disruption about what the expectations are. So in my own experience, my students are very surprised, but less surprised than they were when I started ungrading 10 years ago, when nobody had ever heard of it at all. And they had never really seen anything like it unless they were maybe in the arts. So in writing classes, they've done kind of contract grading, labor-based grading. It comes very naturally in creative fields, but in other fields, they really haven't seen it before. But now there are a handful of people in a bunch of different departments who are doing less conventional practices. But when I started, I explained it once, and then the students were really scared, and they were scared all semester. Now I kind of show them, we're going to do this stuff. It's going to be fun. You're going to learn things, and I'm not going to grade it. And that's what it's going to be like. And I explain it again, and I show them again. And it's been possible for me because I am a full professor and I have tenure. I have every protection. I am a white woman. That matters. I am at a university that has resources, but my classes are not immense. So all of those things that I have, other people don't necessarily have. So it's harder and harder and harder for people if they are a person of color, if they don't have tenure protections, if they have enormous classes, if they're part of a system of, let's say, their course has to feed into another course. So they have to be sure that their students have covered this material. But there are more and more people questioning this. And so structurally, I think it's helpful. One of my motives for editing the ungrading book was so that there was something published by an academic press that a person who's vulnerable can show an administrator so that they are not accused of doing something irresponsible. In these intervening 6 years, there's been more and more and more research lots of writing about it, lots of writing by lots of people trying to do comparisons. You can't do like a double-blind study of graded and ungraded classes because obviously people know. Um, but there are a lot of people doing all kinds of research, the kind of research that is persuasive, that has numbers. You take an ungraded physics class and a graded physics class, and you compare them to what they know at the end of the semester, or a math class, the kinds of STEM courses that tend to persuade people. And then you can see, do they learn as much if they aren't coerced the same way? So there is a lot of research. I always recommend that if someone is trying to undertake something like this, they find a buddy, somebody at their same level that they can honestly work through some of this stuff, and then a champion, somebody at a higher level who can protect them a little bit. Also, it's helpful to start slow. Maybe I think actually one of the most important things about ungrading is the reflection and the metacognitive dimension of it, so that not all of the evaluation comes from the teacher, so that students are developing their own sense of quality and standard that they can take with them once they leave our classroom. And so you can always ask people, okay, here, and in this age of AI, which is, a whole other topic, if students are writing something or doing a project or something, ask them to reflect on what they learned, what was hard, what was easy, what they need help with. And I have found that actually to be more illuminating usually than the actual project that they produce.
Yeah. Jason, what has been your experience in the classroom with the students using these alternative methods of assessment? One concern that people might have is that less learning happens, and a less excellent uh, um, training happens in the classroom, because it sounds like we are just lenient teachers. And so what has been your experience with that?
Well, there is something that's more lenient about it, I guess. It's a looser feel because you're all three of us have, over the course of this conversation, talked in different ways about the adversarial relationship that the typical approach to education kind of creates without anyone really wanting it to happen, or no one's trying to create an adversarial relationship, but it just sort of is that way. And so I think the moment you relieve everyone of that adversarial atmosphere, that malaise, that is a lenient thing. I mean, it's a looser, like, you're not my enemy and I'm not yours. We're just here to do some stuff together. So I'm not so worried about people thinking I'm lenient. I think it is more lenient. That's part of the issue. But my experience with my students, I think I'm with Susan on this. I'm a little more interested in their metacognition than I am in their final product. Uh, Partly because I know from my own experience, I barely remember what I learned. I don't know when I learned what I learned. I can't. There are a few very important teachers and a few very important classes that stand out, but other than that, my knowledge, my education is just a blob in my head that just somehow it's there. And so I know that I also know I learned more than I've retained, like I've forgotten quite a bit of what I've learned. So I try to keep that in mind with my students, that, yeah, I can flood you with all this content and I can put you through all of these paces. There's just a really good chance that even by, a month or two from now, you're not going to remember what we did. And so, my experience with my students has been more and more and more focused on their responsibility for their education rather than their facility with using, the tools of my discipline. Some of this is to do with the fact that I teach theology, which is among the most pointless um, disciplines in the Americans, way of viewing education. So of course I don't think that, but that of course all my students think, well, there's no reason for a class like this to exist. And so it's even more the case that I'm not going to get the kind of buy-in into like doing the discipline. And so I'm just sort of, in addition to being, white and tenured and having small classes and all of those things that make this possible, there is a way that in which my discipline allows me to be um, pretty loose with my methods. I can experiment, in other words. Um, my experience, or I think my students' experience, the word that always comes up for me is honesty. We have way more honest conversations about what is going on in the classroom and what is going on in their work than we ever did when there were grades involved. Um, Part of that, I think, is due to the fact that in the absence of that adversarial relationship, they trust me more.
Mhm.
I have committed to them. I want to help you work at the level that you want to work at. You told me some things at the beginning of the semester about what kind of class you want to have or what kind of course you want to have this semester. And I have promised you I will not abandon you. I will help you achieve your goals. Just that simple move at the beginning means that they're more willing to speak honestly with me about what they've done and what they've failed to do. um, that also then frees me up to be brutally honest with them. Well, you said you wanted to work at an A level or a B level. What is this? How does this, what you're doing, whatever the behavior is or whatever the product is or whatever we're looking at, how does that line up with what you stated as your goal at the beginning of the semester? And they're old enough to appreciate the dissonance between what they say they're gonna do and what they actually do. But they know that I'm not trying to trick them, or I don't have like a pile of grades that I don't want to give away or something. They just know I'm here to help you learn. And one of the consistent experiences I think a sizable portion of my students are having is that they just don't really want to be in college. They Not that college is bad, but I'm here because I was told to be here. I'm not here because I want to be here. It's just the next thing we have to do, and we can like finally talk about that. And I think for some of them, over the course of their study over the 4 years, they find their reason for being in college, which I hope transforms their approach to what they're doing. It's really nice to have a goal, you know, um, aside from one imposed on you by just everyone else's expectations. So I think my experience of engaging with my students, yes, it's more lenient, less adversarial. It's more honest, and so you, I think, Susan, it was in the edited volume. I won't be able to remember the exact piece, but someone was reporting on what their students, sort of that metacognitive, like self-reporting at the end of the semester. One of their students said, "This was the easiest A I ever got and the hardest class I ever took." And I thought, what an amazing set of clauses. Like this is not supposed to go together, right? And I'm always trying to achieve that with them. The confidence that I can work at an A level. This guy told me he would help me. But then that means I've really got to like do that work. He's going to continue to not just support me, but kind of bug me until I've risen to my own expectations. And I ask the students every semester whether I should keep doing this, and they always say yes. The students who take multiple classes with me become very familiar with the method, and then are right on board. Um, and of course, there are always students who um, either silently or out loud resent what I'm doing. I've had one direct experience of this. A student was doing verbal exams with me, and he came in, was clearly unprepared. I said, "Oh, pause. yeah, I think you need to do this, 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 and this. Come back next week. Let's try again. Comes back the next week. Still not doing it. I think he came back 3 times. The last time he came back, he's like, I just wish you would give me a multiple choice exam. And I said, why would you want that? And he said, because I don't have to really know anything to pass the multiple choice exam. But if we keep talking like this, I have to know what I'm talking about in this conversation. And I just don't want to do that. I was like, beautiful, beautiful. I'm not telling you to drop out, but maybe you should drop out. I mean, like, if you hate this and there's no reason for you to do it, then maybe you should stop doing it, you know? So that kind of epitomizes the negative response to what we're doing. The positive response is just like, they don't barely even talk about it. They just start doing amazing work, and we have great conversations, and they become almost like friends. Definitely partners, community partnering. What was the phrase from the dicastery or on the
Community
journey
of
to truth?
learners. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way. We are accomplishing something
Mhm.
together. Susan, you mentioned earlier that one of the things you have to question is whether you have a responsibility to the people in your, like, if you're a student, do I have a responsibility to the other people, the other students in the class? I don't know why I can't think of the word classmates. Unbelievable. Anyway, this has also been, I think, a part of their experience. Since the responsibility for the learning is on them, they realize that if they don't rise to the level that they said they wanted to, they're actually compromising what other people are able to accomplish as well. And I think for a lot of them, this is the first time they've realized that they have a role to play. The classroom is a subsidiary structure, and you actually have a job to do beyond getting points.
Right, exactly. And I have people telling me, I mean, aside from what you've said, like they tell me every semester, this is the first time I've ever learned for myself. This is the first time I haven't forgotten everything as fast as I took the test. You know, test taking, you can guess the answer even if you don't know, just by like, oh, the last 3 answers were C. This one's probably A because I've eliminated D. And that doesn't mean you know anything. That means you know test taking skills. And this whole game of school and the grading game, that's clearly not what we really want them to learn. But I had something, I was going somewhere about this community of learners and the responsibility. Um, and I was going to say something, but I was filling in these other things first. But
It'll come back.
it will once we hang up. Once,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I also, it's important. Oh, students tell me, I remember now, that in many of their classes, even if they're not huge classes, they don't know each other's names.
Mm.
And they just come in, sit there, and leave. So the active learning structures, you know, combining people in different ways, having them talk to each other, that really helps develop this sense. And then in some classes, I give them jobs. I have them sign up for jobs. This semester, in one of my classes, I'm having collective note taking. So at the end of the class, they jot down what happened in the class because things happen that aren't predictable necessarily. And because so much happens in our actual interaction. So they are each assigned 2 different class periods in pairs, and they write these notes. I have a lot of athletes who are absent a lot, and it's their excused absences, or I have a lot of people who are ill, or they have interviews for graduate school, or you know, they have legitimate reasons for missing class. But if things happen in the classroom in this community of learners where it's emergent rather than sort of just enacting the predetermined activities, I want them to know kind of what's happened. So that's been a positive thing, and that means they're thinking about each other a little bit. So, yeah.
So I think certainly one of the great achievements of this different way of assessment is the relational value, the relational power that it has. This truly has helped me enter in the kind of one-on-one, deeply personal mentoring and relationship with my students that Catholic education always says it wants to encourage. And it's not that it did not happen at all before, but now it's really encouraged, it's really incentivized. The system is conducive to that. I've never seen my students more than one-on-one than since I've started this feedback-based method that I use. I've never known about them and their personal stories and challenges and needs and aspirations more than because of the ongoing relationship and conversation. And so as a theologian, as somebody who works at a Catholic institution, the incarnational, relational commitments that are at the heart of how we describe ourselves and what we want to accomplish are really served by these alternative modes of assessment. And then I really try to encourage the relational aspect among them. At the beginning of the semester, we went through an exercise to build the syllabus together, naming the goals that we wanted to achieve in the class. And as people individually and then in groups contributed to the discussion, it became clear that there were skills that the students wanted to gain. There were content questions. This was an introduction to theology class, so there were content questions. But then there were also social goods that they wanted to cultivate and achieve. Things like friendship and the ability to be more confident in addressing others. So it's interesting how when we ask our students what are they looking for, this aspect of the social goods of the college experience features rather prominently. I actually think that a big motivation for many to continue their education career is the social goods, let's call them, that come with the experience, going away from home for the first time and finding yourself in a community of peers and the fun that you have in college and all of that. And again, we can think of that as a side gig, so to speak, as something that they do on their own and that it's really not important to real education, the real education that happens in the classroom. Or we can keep that in mind and make the classroom an extension and something that is integrated into this greater pursuit of friendship and community and belonging that seems very important to my students, to our students, I think. Now, I do want to take up the cause of content for a moment here. I find myself teaching core curriculum classes, general education classes that everybody who enrolls at them on Abbey College needs to take. But I also find myself teaching a number of classes for majors. We have about 25 to 30 majors who are pursuing one of our theology-related degrees. And they are doing it most of the time because they have an interest then in working for the church and in the church, whether it is as teachers, as director of religious education, youth ministers, and the like. And accordingly, I do feel a need to impart, to hand on content, the riches of the Catholic tradition, the riches of Scripture, in ways that will empower them to hand it on in turn. So that in my mind, the feedback-based assessment method I use, it's not it's not against excellence in terms of knowing theology. It is instead a more effective way to going about achieving that excellence. Because now, again, to go back to the Trinity example, if students know 2 persons of the Trinity out of 3, I will not let them stay there if they have described, as most of them do, that they want to achieve mastery of what we are doing together. And that pushing could not happen before, or better, I would give the feedback, but we know that then that feedback under a traditional mode of grading remains there, and most often is more a justification of the points that professors have taken away, or the grades that professors have assigned, than an invitation to further work. And again, that invitation to further work, I think, can really uphold the standards of our disciplines in ways that are empowering and stretch our students' ability to go really excellent work.
For
Yeah,
sure.
I think sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Oh,
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, obviously there are things people have to know, but if they have to know it for a reason other than just passing a test, that is much more of a motivation, and it's more likely that it will stick. If you remind them, you are going to have the responsibility of imparting this information to people in the school where you're going to be the principal or something. So you have to get this right, or you have to know how to look for it. So obviously we can't teach everything. And the world Catholic theology evolves, but there is a body, a canon that is not changing so much. In a lot of other fields, things will change so much that whatever content we teach in 2026, by 2036, that's not what they're going to be needing. So what are we doing? What is the kind of minimum foundation, along with the skill for more learning independently, that we need to get to? And paring things down can be helpful, although it goes against my inclination, but philosophically I believe in it, and I keep trying to fight myself on that. What are the core things, concepts, what people sometimes call threshold concepts, these things that transform people's understanding, even if it's elaborated in other ways, and there are certain numbers of examples that people have to know, but that's a debatable number. So in my field, we have 100 and some years of ethnographies. When I was a student many years ago, we read a lot of them. Now, in the intervening decades, there have been a lot more. And so people can't read everything, and what do they feel the obligation to need? What to read? What are the classics that you have to read to be a credible anthropologist? Hard to know.
Yeah.
Jason, what did you want to say?
Well, first, that I'm jealous that you have 25 to 30 majors. I have 2. And so that changes a little bit of how this works for me. But what I've noticed in teaching mostly gen ed elective students rather than majors is that this method has enabled the students who don't really, they're just there because they have to be there. It's enabled them to find something, and it's opened them to our keyword is fascination. But then when I do have a major, they can be on kind of like their own track as well, so that I can do both things at once. The strong, something to strive for, and the weak, nothing to fear. So yeah, I'm with you. I don't want to. We do need to defend content, absolutely. Earlier we were talking about metacognition and everything. I think part of the reason I'm most interested in the metacognition is because I have this lack of majors, and I'm just like, yeah, you're barely dipping your toe in my discipline, and listening to you talk about what that's like is a lot more interesting than, yeah. So I'm pro content. I'm with you, Alessandro. I love our content. I love it.
But of course, something that is important to think about is how this umbrella term that we use, ungrading, that names all sorts of different experimentations and practices, is really tied to the specific context, the institution, the students, right? So that no two professors almost will go about finding these new assessment methods in the exact same way. Now, I have the privilege of being the chair of my department, which means that I was able to recruit a fantastic colleague who is committed to very similar principles. And so now we are starting to create a departmental method, right, where we collaborate very closely, and students who take our classes can see a similar approach. And just recently, we hired a new faculty colleague for next year, and ungrading became, maybe this is a first, ungrading appeared on the job posting. Maybe that's my claim to fame. Right? And so I engaged in conversations with all the candidates about assessment, especially in the context of AI, which we have not talked much about, but that adds a new layer, right? So internal motivation, responsibilities to a community of learners, social goods, they become even more important in the age of AI, right? Where obviously, if education is just the transmission of content, education becomes obsolete. So all of this is to say that ungrading is an invitation to everybody in all disciplines and in all contexts to really rethink how they can structure their classes and their assessment. Now, we do that, though, with deeply theological and Catholic commitments. That's the whole point of our article in the Journal of Moral Theology. Susan, you were the one who found it and reached out to us to thank us for our work, and then you even engaged with it in your Substack. What caught your attention? Again, we have been learning from you so much, and yet here you are reaching out to two rookies like us that valued what we said. What was it that caught your attention?
Well, I think I have a Google alert or something for the word ungrading, or somehow it came up. And I was actually really intrigued by the perspective you had, because it seemed so aligned with what I'm doing. And I don't know that I've so explicitly talked about it as a moral project. I mean, and also because I teach at a Catholic institution where there is some resistance to what I'm doing. And so I was intrigued by the idea that Catholic theologians were making this case. So I sent your article to our provost and our president because I wanted them to see that this was a deeply principled approach within a discipline that they all recognize as meaningful and formative for them. And that you could, if you go back to basic principles, it would sort of unfold this way. And so I was really intrigued by it.
We gave you ammunition. So glad to hear it.
Well, we support each other, right? I think
True.
this is, many people feel, and I have talked to thousands and thousands of educators in the last few years, and there is a sense that what we're doing isn't working. And it's not working in a whole bunch of ways. And students are not interested. They're going through the motions. They are taking on debt. They are cheating. They're outsourcing the learning. You know, what are we here for? And those of us who have been teaching in higher ed, we are deeply committed to this project. And yet, if it ends up being just stamping people's credential, I don't think that's what we want. And that's not enough to fuel me any day, you know, let alone years and years. So I think it's really essential that we interrogate what we're here for, and then how our practices contribute to or are actually undermining our real goals.
You're speaking like a true moral theologian, Susan. You better watch out.
Yeah, I love this because you're right. I didn't get into this to stamp credentials, right? And I think if I hadn't had the experience of that chapter of Benedict's Rule and then encountering your work, Susan, and Alfie Cohn's work, I don't know if I'd still be teaching. Maybe, but it was such a like the idea of going back, of stopping what we're doing and going back is it never occurs to me. But even to entertain the thought right now is so disheartening.
Well,
It was a
there's this
miserable
idea
experience.
that you probably know of moral injury, taking
Yes.
part in an enterprise that is morally compromised. And we can't do that day after day.
Yeah.
We just can't. And I really, in my books, I have been pretty honest because I can be that I had contemplated quitting because
Yeah.
I didn't believe in what I had been doing anymore. And I just couldn't do that again and again. And then, but this change in approach has given me a sort of new lease on life.
100%. Yeah, every semester, this method basically forces you to realize every semester is just going to be a brand new adventure. So many of my students, complaining is not the right word, and tattling is not the right word, but they try to let me know they sit through a lot of classes where they're just read to from a PowerPoint slide. And if that's the method, then semester after semester after semester, it's just a grind because you know exactly what you're getting into as the professor. There is no adventure. I'm going to read these PowerPoints to these silent humans.
Yeah.
But if we're doing what we're doing, I have no idea what is going to happen. No idea. And that's thrilling. And it relieves me of this sense that I'm just like running out of steam over time. Rather, I'm reawakening at the beginning of every semester, So yeah, there's an element of this that's a little bit self-serving, right? I'm happier doing this. I'm having more fun. It's more interesting to me. But I think that's good for my students. Sitting under the instruction of someone who's unhappy, not interested, and that's such a bummer. Such a bummer.
Jesus invited his disciples on a journey of discovery, and that would allow them to grow in certainty, trust, and love. And I think that it's important for education to mimic that same invitation to begin an adventure of freedom, our students and our peers. Susan and Jason, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation.
Thank you.
There's more to come, I'm sure. We look forward to your work on why students read or don't read. I'm sure we'll learn from that as much as we have learned from everything else you have been teaching us.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and keep doing what you're doing. It really makes a difference.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Many blessings and goodbye.